There is an account that has been passed around in certain circles for a very long time. You will not find it in any textbook. You will not find it on any official record that anyone can produce. And yet the story refuses to die. People keep telling it, keep writing it down, keep swearing they heard it from a grandfather who worked the docks, or from a yellowed letter in a box in an attic somewhere in Michigan. The account goes like this. In the late summer of 1888, the surface of Lake Superior fell, not by inches, not by the normal seasonal shift that every lakeman knew and expected. It fell by 14 feet. And when the water pulled back from the shallows near the western shore, it exposed something lying in the mud that should not have been there. A ship, an old ship. A hull unlike anything built by anyone living in North America at the time. And within days, according to the story, men in uniform arrived, cordoned off the shoreline. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence. Discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And the lake was refilled to its normal level before the month was out. Same week, some versions say. The water came back, the wreck vanished under it again, and the whole thing was folded quietly out of history. Now, before we go any further, I want to be completely honest with you about what this is. This is not a documented event. There is no verified record of Lake Superior dropping 14 feet in 1888. There is no catalogued Bronze Age wreck sitting in a museum with a placard. What we have is an account, a story that circulates. And the question I want to sit with for the next while is not simply is it true? The question is why a story like this exists at all, what it borrows from real history, and why it keeps finding new people willing to believe it. Because here is the thing about the best of these stories. They are never built from nothing. They are stitched together from real threads. And if you want to understand why this one has legs, you have to understand the world it is set in. Let me take you back to Lake Superior in the 1880s. Not the legend, the real place. This was the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area, and to the men who worked it, it was less a lake than a private ocean. Cold enough to kill you in minutes. Deep enough that in places the bottom has never been properly mapped. The southern and western shores were booming. Timber was coming down in enormous quantities. Copper and iron were moving out of the ranges in tonnages that were reshaping the American economy. Duluth was exploding from almost nothing into a working port. Whole towns appeared in a single season because the trees and the ore said they should. And moving all of that was a fleet of wooden ships and early steel steamers that were, frankly, being pushed harder than they were designed to be. The lake took them regularly. Storms came out of nowhere. Vessels went down with everyone aboard and were simply never found. There is a real, verifiable reason Lake Superior earned the reputation it has. It swallows things. It keeps them. So already you can see why a story about a hidden wreck feels plausible when it lands here. This is a place where wrecks genuinely disappear and are genuinely never recovered. The lake is a natural vault. A storyteller does not have to work hard to make you believe something is buried out there, because things are buried out there. That part is not a lie. Let me put you on that shoreline for a moment, in the real 1880s, because the atmosphere matters. Picture the western end of the lake. Duluth on one side, the Wisconsin and Minnesota shore stretching away, and behind it, forest that seemed to go on forever until men with saws proved it did not. The air in a port town smelled of pine pitch and coal smoke and lake water. The docks ran day and night in the warm months, because the lake froze hard in winter and closed the whole system down, so everything had to move while it could. Ships loaded ore that came down from the ranges on rail, and loaded lumber cut from the giant white pines that were, right at that moment, being turned into the houses of a growing country. Fortunes were being made in a single season, and lost just as fast. And the men who did the actual work were, for the most part, invisible to history. Loggers, dockhands, deckhands, oar trimmers, many of them immigrants who spoke little English, most of them transient, drifting from camp to camp and port to port as the work moved. They did not keep diaries. Newspapers did not record their names unless they died in some spectacular way. When one of them told a strange story in a boarding house or a saloon, that story lived only in the retelling. It was never written down, never checked, never dated. It just passed from mouth to mouth. And that, right there, is the perfect soil for a legend. A world full of hard men, real danger, real disappearances, and almost no reliable record of what any of them actually saw. You could claim almost anything happened on that shore in 1888 and there would be no ledger to contradict you. Now, the account also leans on something else that is real, and this is where it gets clever. Lake levels do change. Anyone who has spent time on the Great Lakes knows the water is not fixed. Over years and decades, the levels rise and fall with rainfall, with ice, with how much water is flowing out through the connecting rivers. In dry stretches, shorelines pull back and expose flats that are normally underwater. Old pilings appear. Wreck timbers that were hidden become visible. Beachcombers on the Great Lakes have, in real documented cases, found the ribs of long-lost schooners emerging from the sand during low-water years. So the seed of the story is not absurd. Water recedes, something old appears. That has happened. What the account does is take that ordinary documented phenomenon and crank it to an impossible extreme. 14 feet, all at once, in a single season, with no natural explanation. And then it drops in the one detail that turns a fisherman's tale into something people whisper about for over a century. The wreck was not a schooner. It was Bronze Age. It is worth dwelling on that leap, because it is the exact mechanism these stories use. And once you see it, you will see it everywhere. Start with something true and modest. Great Lakes water levels fall in dry years, and old timbers appear in the shallows. Every long-time resident of those shores knows this is real. Then multiply the true thing until it becomes impossible. A gentle seasonal drop of a foot or two becomes a sudden collapse of 14 feet. A weathered schooner rib becomes an intact ancient hull. The story keeps 1 foot on solid ground the entire time, so at no single step does it feel like you have left reality. You are eased across the gap, one reasonable-sounding sentence at a time, until you are standing somewhere completely absurd, and it feels like you walked there naturally. That is not an accident. That is how a good legend is engineered, whether the teller knows it or not. Let me tell you how the account describes the ship, because the description is oddly specific, and specificity is exactly what makes a story stick. The versions that circulate agree on a few things. The hull was long and low, built from timbers that had gone black and hard as iron from being submerged in that cold, oxygen-poor water. The construction was not nailed the way American ships were nailed. It was joined, fitted together with wooden pegs and mortise planks, the way ancient Mediterranean shipwrights were said to work. There were the remains of a single mast step near the centre. And along what would have been the interior, the men who supposedly saw it described fittings and objects of a dull greenish metal. Not iron, not steel, bronze. Some tellings go further. They describe markings on the timbers or on the metal, not letters anyone recognized. Symbols. And this is the detail that always makes me lean back, because it is doing a very particular job. It is telling the listener that this ship did not merely predate the settlers, or the French, or even the Norse. It predates the entire accepted story of who was here and what they could do. It is a claim that someone crossed an ocean and reached the middle of the North American continent, all the way up into a cold inland sea, thousands of years before the history books say that was possible. Let me give you the account the way it is usually told, so you can feel its pull, and then we will take it apart. In the fullest versions, it begins with a fisherman. He goes out one grey morning and finds the shoreline strange, the water pulled far back from where it should be, mudflats steaming in the cold air where there had always been depth. He walks out onto ground that no living person had ever walked on, and there, half buried and black with age, is the curve of a hull. He fetches others. Word spreads through the port. For a day or two, ordinary people come to look at the impossible thing in the mud. They climb on it. They pry loose a piece of the greenish metal and pass it hand to hand. Someone sketches the symbols, and then, the account says, the uniforms arrive. The beach is closed. The curious are turned away, some politely, some not. Crates are filled, and within days the water is back, higher than anyone remembers seeing it, and the wreck is gone, as if it had never surfaced at all. The fisherman tells the story for the rest of his life. Nobody official ever confirms a word of it. He dies. His children repeat it, and here we are, told well. That is a genuinely gripping tale. You can almost feel the cold mud and the disbelief, and notice what the telling does. It puts an ordinary, relatable person at the center, someone just like the listener, so that you experience the wonder through their eyes before the authorities arrive to take it away. That structure is not chosen by accident either. It makes you feel that you too would have seen it, and that you too would have been silenced. That is an enormous claim, and it is worth pausing on why it is so attractive to a certain way of thinking about the past. There is a whole current of what people call alternative or revisionist history, and it runs on a single emotional engine, the feeling that the official story is too clean, that the timeline we were handed in school is a cover for something bigger, older, and deliberately hidden. In this way of seeing things, ancient people were far more capable than we admit. Great civilizations rose and were erased, and institutions today work quietly to keep the real past buried, because the truth would upend everything. You may have heard the name Tartaria attached to some of this. The specifics vary wildly from teller to teller, but the emotional core is always the same. What if the world is much older and much stranger than they told you? And what if someone knows and is keeping it from you? The Lake Superior account is almost a perfect specimen of this way of thinking. It has the lost advanced past, it has the impossible artifact, and it has the cover-up delivered by men in uniform. That last piece is the key that locks everything together, so let us talk about it. But first, the choice of a Bronze Age ship specifically deserves a moment, because it is not random either. There is a long tradition of claims that ancient peoples from the Mediterranean or the Near East crossed the Atlantic and reached the Americas thousands of years before Columbus. Phoenicians, Egyptians, Carthaginians, Israelites. The specific culture changes depending on who is telling the story, but the shape is always the same. Some famous ancient seafaring people, the argument goes, secretly reached this continent, left traces, and mainstream scholars either missed the evidence or buried it. Real fringe authors built entire careers on this in the 20th century, pointing at odd stones, ambiguous carvings, and out-of-place objects, and insisting they proved contact. Actual archaeologists examined those claims and found them wanting, again and again. The stones were natural, the carvings were misread, the objects were later imports or hoaxes. But the appeal never dies, because the underlying wish is powerful. It is the wish for the New World to have a deep, connected, epic ancient past linked to the great civilizations we learn to admire. Bronze pushes exactly that button. Say bronze, and the mind goes straight to antiquity, to Troy, to Homer, to a heroic age of ships and warriors. A Bronze Age wreck in Lake Superior is not just old. It is romantically, mythologically old. It reaches for the same feeling that draws people to the pyramids and the tale of a sunken Atlantis. The account is not really claiming a boat. It is claiming that the deep glamour of the ancient old world reached secretly into the heart of the new, and that someone has been hiding the proof. According to the story, the wreck was not studied openly. It was not announced. Instead, within days of the water dropping, soldiers arrived. In most tellings, they are the Army Corps of Engineers, which is a nice touch, because the Corps really did work on the Great Lakes. They really did build harbours, dredge channels, and manage waterways throughout this exact period. So the account borrows a real institution that really had boots and boats on that shoreline, and it hands them a secret mission. The soldiers, the story says, sealed off the beach. They kept locals away. They photographed or crated whatever they could, and then they did the thing that gives the account its unforgettable hook. They put the water back, 14 feet of it, in the same week. And when the lake returned to its normal level, the wreck was gone. The shoreline looked as it always had, and anyone who talked about what they had seen was simply not believed. Now, I want to be very direct here, because this is exactly the point where a story like this either respects your intelligence or insults it. Refilling Lake Superior by 14 feet in a week is not a cover-up. It is a physical impossibility. Lake Superior holds an almost incomprehensible volume of water. To raise its entire surface by 14 feet, you would need a quantity of water that no army on Earth, then or now, could move on any timescale, let alone in days. There is no valve, there is no pump. The lake is fed by rain, snowmelt, and rivers, and it drains slowly through a single outflow. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The idea that engineers topped it off like a bathtub is not history being hidden, it is physics being ignored. And that, oddly, is where this gets interesting to me. Because a story does not survive for over a century by being believable in every detail. It survives because it delivers a feeling that people want to keep feeling. The impossible refill is not a bug in the story. It is the emotional climax. It is the moment the account says to you, they can do anything. They can even put the ocean back. That is how powerful the people hiding the truth really are. It is not meant to pass a physics exam. It is meant to make your skin prickle. So let me try to separate the threads, honestly, because you deserve to know which parts stand on solid ground and which parts float on nothing. Solid ground. Lake Superior is real, enormous, cold, and genuinely full of unrecovered wrecks. That is true. Great Lakes water levels really do fall in dry years and really have exposed old shipwreck timbers. That is true. The Army Corps of Engineers really was active on those shores in the 1880s doing serious engineering work. Also true. Duluth and the Western Shore really were booming with timber and ore, full of transient workers whose stories were rarely written down. True again. Now the nothing. A 14-foot single-season drop with no natural cause has no record and no mechanism. A Bronze Age vessel in Lake Superior has never been documented, catalogued, or produced. And a military operation refilling the lake in a week is physically impossible. Those three pillars, the ones the whole account actually rests on, are the three that vanish the moment you touch them, which leaves us with a story that is real around the edges and hollow in the centre. And I think that shape is worth understanding, because it is the shape of almost every enduring conspiracy account you will ever encounter. True context wrapped around an untrue claim. The truth on the outside is what makes the lie on the inside feel safe to swallow. But I do not want to just wave the story away, because if we stop at "it is not true," we miss the more interesting question. Why does anyone want it to be true? What need is this account feeding? Think about who tends to carry stories like this. Often it is people who feel that the official world has not been straight with them. And you know what? They are not always wrong to feel that way. History, as it was taught for a long time, really did erase people. The full presence and sophistication of the peoples who lived around these lakes for thousands of years before any European arrived was genuinely minimized, ignored, and in some cases deliberately buried by those who came later. That is a real erasure, and it is documented. So when someone comes along and says the accepted history is incomplete and something older was here, they are tapping into a suspicion that has an entirely legitimate root. And here is a genuine irony that the legend completely misses. There really is an astonishing ancient history in the Lake Superior region, and it involves metal, and it is real. For thousands of years, long before any European set foot here, the indigenous peoples of this area mined copper from the shores and islands of Lake Superior. This is documented archaeology, not speculation. They dug pits, worked the native copper that occurs in the rock there in unusually pure form, and shaped it into tools and ornaments that were traded across enormous distances of the continent. Archaeologists call the culture associated with the earliest of this work by names like the Old Copper Complex, and the dates run back thousands of years, so the deep truth is almost the reverse of the legend. There was ancient metalworking around Lake Superior. It just was not a lost band of Mediterranean sailors. It was the ancestors of the people who lived here, whose sophistication was real, and whose achievement was for a long time downplayed or ignored by the same establishment the conspiracy theorists claim to distrust. The genuine hidden history is more interesting than the invented one, and it has the added advantage of being true. The bronze ship is a distraction from a copper story that actually happened. The tragedy, and I think it is a tragedy, is where that legitimate suspicion gets pointed. Instead of leading people toward the real, rich, complicated history of the actual peoples of this continent, the Tartaria style of story sends them chasing a Mediterranean bronze ship that never existed. It takes a true feeling and spends it on a false object. The hunger is real. The meal is fake. There is also the simple pleasure of the secret. To believe this account is to believe you know something the crowd does not. That is a powerful feeling. It flips the usual script. Suddenly you are not the person who missed the lesson in school. You are the person who sees through the lesson. The official experts become the ones who are fooled or complicit, and you become the one who is awake. For anyone who has ever felt overlooked or talked down to, that reversal is intoxicating. The account does not just offer a mystery, it offers you a promotion. And then there is the shape of the thing as pure story, which we should not underestimate. Water pulls back. A relic from an impossible age lies revealed in the mud, black and silent, older than the country standing on the shore. For a handful of days, a few ordinary men look upon something that rewrites everything. And then the authorities come, and the water rises, and the secret sinks back into the cold and the dark, and the world goes on exactly as before, none the wiser. That is, whether it happened or not, a genuinely haunting piece of storytelling. It has the rhythm of a myth, the revelation and the reburial, the glimpse and the silence. That pattern, the thing revealed and then hidden again, is older than any of us, and it shows up all over the world. Think of the countless legends of sunken cities glimpsed beneath the waves on a clear day and never found again. Think of the buried treasure that is always dug up just as the searcher is turned back. Think of the sacred object seen once and then lost, the door in the hillside that opens for a moment and cannot be found the next morning. Human beings have been telling reveal and rebury stories for as long as we have been telling stories at all. They satisfy something deep. They let us believe the world holds wonders, while explaining, conveniently, why we never quite get to keep one. The Lake Superior account is a very modern-sounding version of an extremely ancient template. Swap the army for a dragon, swap the crates for a curse, and you have a folktale that could be 5,000 years old. The costume is new, the bones are not. Recognizing that does not make the story less interesting. If anything, it makes it more interesting, because it shows you are looking at something the human mind reaches for again and again, dressed this time in uniforms and lake water. I think that rhythm is most of why it survives. It is built like a legend, so it behaves like one. It gets a little more detailed with each telling. Someone adds the symbols on the timbers. Someone adds a great uncle who was chased off the beach at gunpoint. Someone adds a specific date. And every added detail makes it feel more solid, even though none of the details can ever be checked, because the story has a built-in reason they can never be checked. The evidence was taken. The lake was refilled. The witnesses were silenced. The account explains its own lack of proof, which is the neatest trick any legend can pull. The absence of evidence becomes, in the logic of the story, the strongest evidence of all. Look how thoroughly they hid it, the account whispers. That is how you know it was real. It is worth thinking about how a story like this actually travels across 130 years, because the path shows you why it changes shape. In the beginning, if there ever was a beginning, it would have moved by voice alone. A tale in a boarding house, a story a dock worker told his kids, a rumour that got a little larger each time it was passed. Then perhaps it found its way into the margins, a local curiosity column, a regional book of lake lore that gathered up odd tales without vouching for any of them. In print, even print that made no claim to be true, the story hardened. Being written down gave it a false dignity. People would later cite it as if the mere fact that it appeared somewhere meant it must have started with something. Then came the age of the photocopy and the mailing list, where fringe history circulated hand to hand among enthusiasts who traded these accounts like collectors. And finally, the internet, which is the greatest amplifier of unverifiable stories ever built, where the account could be copied, embellished, illustrated, and presented with total confidence by people who had no idea where it came from and no way to check. At every stage, the story lost its origins and gained conviction. That is the opposite of how truth behaves. A true account gets more traceable over time as records accumulate. This one gets less traceable and more certain, which is the signature of a legend, not a fact. But that reasoning eats itself if you look at it for even a moment. A claim that becomes more convincing the less proof it has is not a claim you can ever test, and a claim you can never test is not really a claim about the world. It is a mood wearing the costume of a fact. And here is the part the account most needs you not to think about. Consider how a real discovery of this magnitude would actually unfold. If genuine evidence of an ancient transatlantic ship turned up in the middle of North America, it would not be buried. It would be the archaeological find of the century, and every museum, university, and government on Earth would be fighting to be associated with it, not to hide it. Careers are made on discoveries, not on cover-ups. The scholar who confirmed something that rewrote the human story would become one of the most famous people alive. Nations use finds like this for prestige. The idea that an army would rush to make the greatest artifact in history disappear gets the incentives exactly backwards. Secrecy is not how power treats a world-changing relic. Display is. The account asks you to believe that the one thing everyone would want to shout about is the one thing they chose to drown. That is not how discovery works, and somewhere in us we know it, which is why the story has to work so hard, with its silenced witnesses and its impossible refill, to keep that obvious objection from surfacing. So where does that leave us, with this ship in the mud, this 14-foot drop, this army with its impossible mission? I think it leaves us somewhere more honest and, in its own way, more interesting than the legend. There is no bronze wreck under Lake Superior that we have any reason to believe in. But the lake really does hold wrecks that no one has ever found, and it really will surrender some of them someday when the water is low and the light is right, and those will be the genuine ones, the schooners and the steamers full of men who died in real storms on a real and dangerous sea. Their stories are true, and they are enough. They do not need a fake ancient hull to be worth telling. And the account itself, the legend, is also worth keeping. Not as a fact, but as a specimen. A near-perfect example of how a story gets made. Take a real and vast lake. Add a real phenomenon of receding water. Borrow a real institution with real boots on the shore. Wrap all of that true context around one impossible object and one impossible act, and give the whole thing a reason it can never be disproved. Then let it drift from teller to teller, gathering detail like a hull gathers barnacles, until it feels less like a rumor and more like a memory the world agreed to forget. That is not history. But it is a remarkably good imitation of history, and understanding how the imitation works is a kind of armor. Once you can see the seams, once you can spot the true context stitched around the hollow claim, once you notice the moment a story starts explaining away its own missing proof, you become very hard to fool. Not just about a lake and a wreck, but about anything. You start to notice the same machinery running under 100 other stories, the ones about hidden chambers and silenced experts and evidence that always vanishes just before anyone independent can examine it. The Lake Superior wreck is a small, cold, beautiful example of a pattern that is everywhere once you learn its shape. So no, the water did not drop 14 feet in the summer of 1888. No Bronze Age ship lay waiting in the shallows. No army refilled the greatest of the Great Lakes in a single week. But somewhere out there, someone is telling their version of this tonight, adding one more detail, one more uncle, one more symbol carved in blackened oak. And the story will sink a little deeper into the cold, and wait, and rise again for the next person willing to believe that the world is older and stranger than they were ever told. The lake keeps its real secrets, thousands of them, down in the cold and the dark where the storms carried them under. This is just not one of them.